Kevin, can you hear us now?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Feel free to proceed with the introductions of our speakers.
Wonderful. Good afternoon to East Coasters and good morning to West Coasters. Thank you very much for calling into this presentation by Grantmakers for Education. I'm Kevin Jennings. I'm the Executive Director of the Arcus Foundation. We are a global funder that focuses on bringing equality and justice for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, as well as ensuring conservation and respect for the great apes of the world. I think the real reason I'm the moderator, though, today is that my background is primarily in the field of education, most recently as Assistant Deputy Secretary for Safe and Drug-Free Schools under Arne Duncan and the Obama administration. We're going to hear from a couple of folks today who have really wonderful experience on the ground working on issues of gender, race, education, and other equity issues. Then we're going to open it up for some questions from you, and then we're going to close with some thoughts about what philanthropists need to be thinking about as they take this content home with them. So I'll introduce them both first and then ask Monique to be the first speaker, I think. Monique Morris is a 2012 Soros Justice Fellow hosted by the African American Policy Forum. Monique has more than 20 years of professional and volunteer experience in the areas of education, juvenile justice, civil rights, and social justice. She's also the CEO of MWM Consulting, which advances concepts of fairness, diversity, and inclusion. She's the author of Too Beautiful for Words and the co-writer of Poster Child, The Kimba Smith Story. She's also a lecturer for St. Mary's College of California in their Master's in Leadership Studies program and a frequent commentator and lecturer on issues pertaining to race, gender, rights, and social justice. Geoffrey Winder is the Senior Manager of the Racial and Economic Justice Program at the GSA, which stands for Gay Straight Alliance Network. Geoffrey's a youth organizer with over a decade of experience in the GSA student movement. His political lens has been formed through his deep involvement in the GSA and queer youth movements, as well as organizing in the global justice, housing rights, labor rights, prison abolition, and anti-war movements for over a decade. He studied politics and history and holds a bachelor's degree in change theory and globalization from NYU's Gallatin School for Individualized Study. In 2011, as GSA Network's Racial and Economic Justice Manager, and currently as the Senior Manager for Racial and Economic Justice Programs, Geoffrey continues deepening GSA Network's educational justice analysis, as well as alliances to ensure the needs of LGBTQ low-income youth of color are represented in national school reform efforts. So I'm very excited to turn the microphone, as it is, over to Monique, I think.
Thank you. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me.
Well, I can hear you.
Okay. And I'm just moving everything over.
Great.
I would like to begin just by saying that it is a pleasure and honor to participate in this call. I know many of you that are on the call as participants have had an opportunity to speak with me at some point regarding my work, both as a Soros Justice Fellow and in other capacities. I want to begin just by saying that the work that I'm going to talk about today is really about developing school-to-confinement advocacy frameworks and really looking at how that might become inclusive of black girls. We are currently in a space in our discussions about school-to-prison pipelines, in discussions about how we might engage in racial justice agendas, gender equity agendas that, for the most part, have remained stagnant and siloed. And so what my work has been, both as a fellow and prior to the fellowship, is to look at how we might think about things a little differently. So I want to start by talking about how we have come to understand this issue. The prevailing consciousness around how we describe what is happening between schools and conditions of confinement has been through the lens of a school-to-prison pipeline. That, I describe, is the collection of policies, practices, conditions, and the prevailing consciousness that facilitate the criminalization within educational environments and the processes by which this criminalization results in the incarceration of youth and young adults. Absent from that discussion has largely been the black girls. Where are they? Where are our girls in this conversation? Before you now, you see pictures of girls, and typically when I engage in this conversation, I ask people to respond to what it is that they're seeing. And I get responses such as, oh, I see sad girls, or I see girls in the media, or I see girls being arrested. The image that's on the top row center was actually used in a training in West Virginia where a presiding juvenile court judge said he saw a girl behaving badly or misbehaving, which was shocking because what we're actually looking at here are images of 6- and 7-year-old girls who have been arrested for having tantrums, you're looking at mugshots of girls who have taken things from the school, but instead of it being responded to with love or with other types of interventions, they were met with arrest and incarceration, or at least placement in a police vehicle, which furthers or facilitates that criminalization that I was referring to earlier. When we engage in this conversation about the role of schools, because we start with the school and we talk about school-to-prison pipeline, we start with the schools and what is the function of schools. I want to talk a little bit about two theoretical frameworks that have been guiding my work and the work of the African American Policy Forum with respect to this issue. I want to start with this theory of social reproduction. So according to this theory, educational institutions in their pedagogy, design, structure, practice, they all serve to reproduce social hierarchies. And Purcell further described a structure of dominance in which societal biases are reinforced through institutions and individuals who work in and sustain these institutions. So in this context, educational institutions that are not intentionally seeking to be learning organizations or evolving in the context of their intentional desire for knowledge and social change are those that continue their reproductive role in churning out individuals who will adeptly maintain racial and social stratification, which is why we have schools that churn out the sort of same product over and over again. Certain schools are designed to produce certain types of students, mostly all of it designed to maintain a status quo. So these institutions impose a context and really a proposition of power that informs socio-spatial designations for children. And my research has shown that as black girls become adolescents, the socialization influences of these schools may become critically important, and in some ways it may positively or negatively amplify the implied or stated objectives for black women in society. The other primary theory framework that guides this work is this concept of intersectionality. And this is a concept that has been developed by the African American Policy Forum. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's the executive director, has a great quote that says, "Black women's lives cannot be captured wholly by looking at race or gender dimensions of those experiences separately." And really what intersectionality is it's a core part of critical race theory that rejects the idea that you can have a single axis analysis and that a single factor can explain the biases that individuals or the discrimination that individuals are facing. So it requires that we look at the relationships between multiple identities and engage in a rigorous interrogation of what structural forms are associated with the outcomes of these girls. So those two frameworks around social reproduction in schools and intersectionality are really at the center of the work that we're seeing and how we're moving forward with in understanding where and how to situate Black girls in particular along this continuum, and specifically within what people commonly understand as the school-to-prison pipeline. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the stats and what we know nationwide. Education, like justice, is very local. And so you'll start to see trends at the local level, certainly that emerge. My work as a Soros Fellow has been to look at California in depth, but I've also been looking at Boston and also looking at New York with the support of the Schott Foundation. And so we're starting to see some things emerge. But for this work, you know, when we look at what is captured nationwide for Black girls with respect to school discipline, we see that 16% of Black middle school girls have been suspended, as compared with 9.6% of Native American girls, 8.5% of Latinas, 4% of white girls in this age group. And that Black females have the largest per district increase in school suspensions among any group, male or female. The other issue is that Black girls have the highest rates of residential placement and secure confinement. And so what's missing from this stat, of course, is the comparison between Black girls and Black boys. And that is intentionally done because if you're using a structural analysis that really looks at the conditions of girls, it is an inappropriate comparison to make between girls and boys. Girls will never have the same delinquency rates as boys. And so to sort of suggest that, you know, we should make a comparison between what's happening with Black boys and Black girls, it reflects a racial analysis, but it doesn't include a rigorous intersectional analysis around gender, where the appropriate comparisons really should be made among girls. So we started to have a conversation, if you will, with the public around some of this work through a paper that I recently released called Race, Gender, and the School-to-Prison Pipeline. And what it is a review of the literature on the pipeline and talks about some of the unique conditions that are affecting Black girls. I have since rejected the term school-to-prison pipeline when I'm talking about girls, because really what we're looking at are school-to-confinement pathways, and that there's not a linear way by which girls are engaged in conditions of confinement from their schools. And there's not a sort of linear path between educational factors and their ultimate incarceration or confinement. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. So if you hear my voice sort of, I guess, placing quotes around school-to-prison pipeline, that's the reason why. So some of the key findings from this work was related to the framework that I just presented to you, right? So that we know there is a pipeline is related to how we know one exists. The pipeline analogy is really built from the conditions of males. And so when we think that we're developing advocacy responses or interventions that are addressing the pipeline, oftentimes we're not capturing the pathways that are unique to girls. And so we've rendered Black girls and Latinas to the extent that they're also overrepresented, and Native American girls to the extent that they are also overrepresented. We've rendered them invisible even in our construct around how we're going to define our advocacy agendas. So one of the main things that I say is that, you know, by assuming that girls and boys are going to have sort of the same experiences has really not presented a positive outcome for the girls. We still see rates increasing. We still see individuals, teachers, probation officers, judges, everyone in the community really trying to still grapple with how to deal with these issues. My work in looking at the educational factors that are associated with Black girls in confinement in particular has really found a couple of things that are echoed in the literature. So there is a history of academic marginalization and underperformance. There is a history of abuse and victimization in and out of schools. So not only are we seeing histories of violent and sexual victimization among girls who end up in confinement, we're also looking at how schools then, again, within the context of their function as in this grand theory of social reproduction, how the schools might be facilitating an environment that either allows for there to be this sort of hostile environment for girls, or how they're not responding adequately to this issue of victimization. Another issue that's been emerging in this work is the use of exclusionary discipline, the disparate use of exclusionary discipline in response to Black female gender nonconformity. So in our discussions and in our work with Black girls, the question of gender nonconformity really has two spaces. So there's the sort of theme of gender nonconformity where there might be girls who present as male or who define themselves along a continuum of gender that schools are inadequately, or the teachers and administrators are inadequately prepared to address and or respond to. And those girls, do end up in conditions where they are, I guess, disproportionately subject to exclusionary discipline. But then there's also the question of how our common understandings of what femininity is, how we define what it means to be a girl and a good girl, how that impacts Black girls uniquely if they don't subscribe to some of these pieces. And there are assumptions about, the sexuality of Black girls. There's a moral panic surrounding the school responses to that. And in general, an absence of culturally competent and gender-responsive interventions in the schools where Black children, male and female, predominate. So instructors, administrators might be more inclined to use punishment in response to rule breaking as opposed to law breaking. Or there might be differential treatment of Black girls because of their lingering stereotypes about their femininity. And in those cases, for example, there might be a Black girl who shows up at school on a really hot day wearing short shorts, and she may have a white counterpart who's also wearing short shorts, but the girl who gets sent home is the Black girl because her body is interpreted as somehow being more provocative than her white female counterpart. So these are some of the real examples that we're hearing in interviews and in focus groups, and all of which suggest that we have a lot more work to do. So what might a progressive framework include? This is certainly an issue that is under development and one that I'm hoping that we'll be able to develop together. But what we know is that the current construct is one that doesn't allow for us to engage in a discussion about authentic advocacy, and really that allows us to look at multiple pathways between schools and confinement. Confinement in its broadest sense. Right. So what are these educational factors that are associated with the overrepresentation of Black girls in confinement? How are we constructing a racial justice agenda that doesn't exclusively base intervention strategies, advocacy initiatives, and our own understanding of how we are to engage with this population through the lens of males? Right now, what we have is a problematic racial justice agenda built solely on the conditions of males. We're developing our own space, and I'm so excited about this call because we're beginning that conversation now with you all. But what I have put forward here is a way for us to think about how we might move away from the old framework, which presents racial justice as a zero-sum game, where people make comparisons between males and females and say, the numbers of girls involved in this are really just too small for us to focus on them, or the big numbers really, have to be the males. Males deserve our attention and have received our attention, but really what we're in is a space where we're trying to build community. And so as we look at racial justice in our agenda, it has to be reflective of an intersectional and structural analysis such that we stop making the comparisons between males and females in this particular issue. And we also need to look at how the old framework is absent a gender equity lens, where really we've got a male endangerment theme that encourages the invisibility of females. And it's an unintended consequence, I believe, of the emphasis on really trying to figure out how to prioritize our work in these issues, but rendering one part of the population invisible has really led to some other deeply problematic uses of both discipline practices, exclusionary discipline practices, and ultimately what we're seeing in terms of confinement. A new framework is one in which there might be, race and gender conscious interventions that are gender inclusive and responsive for both males and females, and that is invested in Black girls because they themselves are worthy of investment, not simply because they have given birth to a male or because they are the sister or girlfriend of a male, but to send the message to girls themselves that they are worthy of our investment and that we reject an overall agenda that does not see their value and worth simply because their numbers are smaller than their male counterparts. So I will stop and turn it back to you and look forward to the comments and questions.
Great. I think we're going to go into Geoffrey's presentation probably and then take comments at and questions at the end, if that's okay. So, Geoffrey, can we hear from you?
Perfect, great. Thank you so much. I think it's a perfect place to pick up kind of on where the work of Gay Straight Alliance Network and also the work that we're doing at the intersections, multiple intersections, we could say, of how bias plays out. Excuse me, I'm coming over a little cold. In the way that young folks are receiving disproportionate discipline, and particularly lesbian, bisexual, and transgender young women of color. And I think that, part of what Monique was saying really about intersectionality, LGBT issues, queerness adds another layer of intersection, and it also adds another layer of bias. And so I think that part of the ways in which we're seeing young queer folks play out, have the school to prison pipeline play out in their lives, is that that young queer women are receiving discipline in ways similar to the ways in which other communities are experiencing school discipline, but in particular having the bias of their teachers around their gender identity and their sexual orientation play out in ways that also, are mirroring the ways that it's impacting men. So really quickly, just to go through the goals, hopefully to learn a little bit more about the particular needs of LGBTQ girls and women of color, and then really talk about what the existing data is and the lack of it, and talk a little bit about the intersections about how these school systems and failures to address the issues of LGBT girls and young women of color are leading to, I would totally agree and concur to this pipeline to confinement. So really, there's not much to say on the data except that there's a lack of it. And in the ways in which the study of this issue is playing out in terms of gendered research for boys and men of color, there's really a silence and lack of data around both what's happening with queer young people of color in general, but then in particular around these gender lines. And so, most of what we know is from the work that we do with the GSA clubs and on the ground, and then also from smaller community surveys. The data obviously doesn't include any information about what's happening to transgender students, either trans boys or trans girls of color. There's not much data about what's happening to Asian American, Pacific Islander, or Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian students or women, and then there's a lack of general data about what's happening to immigrant and undocumented youth in schools, and then, coupling all of those identities that are highly vulnerable if they're also queer, there's just no information about that. So according to the Williams Institute, the 2010 census data showed that LGBTQ folks are more likely to be young and people of color, and LGBTQ folks are more likely to be low income. Currently, 94% of the homeless youth service providers work with LGBTQ youth. So we're going to go into really quickly, I'm going to go through some slides about demographics that we do have, and that's basically from San Francisco Unified School District, which does collect data on sexual orientation and gender identity, and then the only other school district is LA Unified. So the San Francisco Unified School District is above the national average, which is between 5 and 7%. It's at 11% identify as LGBTQ, and Q stands for questioning. In San Francisco Unified, 1.6% of students identified as transgender. There's a little bit of research being done at the particular intersections that we're talking about here, which is the Research to Practice Collaborative Race and Gender Disparities out of the University of Indiana, being funded by Atlantic and some other folks. And then there's a study that GSA Network's research team is doing in collaboration with the University of Arizona. And that is particularly on LGBTQ youth and discipline disparities. And Aisha Moody-Mills from the Center of American Progress's LGBT and Racial Justice Project is also doing some research. But those are really the two or the three folks that I'm kind of banking on in the next year to be able to come out with some hard numbers for you. But let's just go into what we hear are the experiences of young queer women of color. So the issues facing, young women of color broadly that Monique talked about still exist structurally and are there for queer girls as well. But in addition, we have then this added layer of homophobia and transphobia that plays out. So the criminalization and then, facing, as most LGBT youth continue to do, unsafe schools and hostile school climates, and then discipline that is harsher based on bias of race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and class. So the latest report from the Center for American Progress, LGBT youth and gender nonconforming youth are significantly overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. Approximately 300,000 lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth are arrested and or detained each year, and more than 60% are Black and Latino. And then although LGBT youth are only 5 to 7% of the overall youth population on the latest surveys, we compose up to 15% of the those in juvenile justice system. And then really just going back to that quickly and coupling that with the fact that in most major metros we're at 40% of the homeless population and 40% of the foster youth population, the situation and the kind of routes to confinement, you could say, for queer young girls are many and multiple, as Monique said. So this is just a really quick survey of kind of what's going on in the school climate. So schools are still hostile. And then, like I said, the data doesn't necessarily break out what the experiences of queer girls of color are. So this is most broadly, but the ones that we know are more relevant to queer girls are like youth are they're 3 times more likely to carry a weapon for personal safety. They have higher rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment. The majority of LGBT youth are harassed based both on race and sexual orientation or gender identity by their peers, have higher rates of substance abuse and mental health issues, and lower academic achievement. I'm just going to go through these. You can look at them, but basically what I had summarized in the previous slide. And then you can see just how incredibly high the rates are for trans students, and I would say particularly trans girls. Obviously, the rates of bullying and harassment affect a student's ability to feel connected to school, desire to be at school. Obviously, we continue to have high truancy rates and be criminalized for that. Generally have lower grades and have higher uses of, higher instances of substance abuse. So I wanted to get into what's going on with kind of the role of teachers and administrators and the bias and unfair sanctions that happen with LGBT youth. Like I said, the data is sketchy, but the best estimates right now, or the current data suggests that LGBT youth of all races are 1.4 times more likely to be suspended than straight youth. LGBT youth are more likely to be given punishment for minor infractions, like speaking out, or for gender transgressions based on gender stereotyping. And then, they're also more heavily sanctioned by police and law enforcement, and are, anecdotally, we find that they're often singled out in similar ways by the police in their function as, school disciplinarians. In a moment, we're going to watch a quick video from a young woman in the Bronx named Dee. It's part of a longer video that came out of the School to Prison Pipeline Action Camp that I just attended in New Orleans. And what I would say about this and what I would say about the work on the ground is that I think that new frame is emerging from the young people who are doing work and activism on the ground around this issue. It's not, it's not unobvious to folks that the majority of folks in the room and doing work on the issue are young women of color. And so I think that, as the solutions come from the young people, that we'll see solutions that are inclusive and encompassing the ways in which young women of color are being impacted.
My name is Daisy Lee, or Dee. I'm from the Bronx, New York. I go by she, her, or hers, and I identify as a lesbian. I had a history teacher who was very Jewish. He, fast. He did, the yarmulke, all the other religious stuff. And he basically projected his beliefs without saying, okay, I'm Jewish, and in my, religion it's not okay to be gay. He told me that, I shouldn't do that, and purposely he failed me 4 times. I went from, the beginning, very beginning, also, I was changing my clothes. I was going from, the typical female to a typical tomboy, basically. I say that I'm an AG, which means the best of girls, so if you hear me say that throughout my story, that's what it is. I went and I started changing to an AG and really changing my style, the way that I walked was different, because I felt comfortable, I really felt like me. And all of a sudden, he started changing his whole attitude to me. He would be nasty with me. He took my papers and purposely failed me and ripped them in my face, bluntly just in my face. That's so disrespectful. And he would go and, he would give me dirty looks. He would, publicly, if I was walking into the room a little late, he would, make it his point to say something. If I was, feeling uncomfortable at the time, I have learning disabilities, so I'm dyslexic, it's hard for me to read, it's hard for me to get up and talk to people who have really bad anxiety attacks. I have post-traumatic stress disorder, so there's a lot wrong with me. And he would purposely pick at everything. He would, sit there and, ask me to read something that I just asked him not to have me read. So, just sitting there, I would stutter and mix up words and say things that weren't there. And, for me, I would see the first and last letter and automatically in between I think of another word. And that's how my brain works. And, I decided that, that made me uncomfortable, so I would start going to class. I would show up later. I was sitting in the classroom, and I had my hat on, and it looked like this, it was pathetic, and there was a whole bunch of people in the class. It was 15 people, and more than half of them had hats on them. More than half of them were boys. So, me being the only AG in the class, because not many people were out at the time really dressing like me, he pointed out that I had a hat on, and he told me to take it off, and I said, but I'm not the only one in the class with a hat on, and he told me, but you're a girl. So what? I am not the only one with a hat on. So, you know, I felt disrespected, and I got up, and I told him, you know what? I have a problem with this. This is not funny. Like, why are you picking on me? And he told me, well, if you didn't dress the way you did, then there would be an issue. I walked out of the class. We had an argument. I got disrespectful. Yes, I got really nasty. And I called him a cute in front of everybody, and everybody started laughing. And I was like, oh, look, now the whole class is on you. How do you like it? And then I got booted out of the class. So I went back to my principal, and now that I'm kicked out of the class because I got to call the ruckus in order for some attention to be drawn, I got switched classes. Now, I didn't do any better in the next class because I felt like I did all this work to be failed on purpose, and now all I'm going to do is go back to the class. Like, I just want to be in school at all. Like, fuck you guys, but in the end, it fucks me. But, you know, I have to pick up on that slack because he wanted to be a jerk and fail me. So, how does that work? Either way, I suffer.
Okay, so that was a shorter version of the video. There's 3 young women that share their stories. And basically, you know, one is Shanella from San Francisco talks a lot about the same things that Monique talked about, basically a relentless kind of process of just getting, picked on by her school administrators. I guess I have some background music. And then, so basically, you know, this is what they're saying they're facing. Unfair discipline, you know, increased rate of citation for minor or subjective sanctions, increased interaction with the police, disproportionate punitive discipline, social and cultural isolation and stigmatization. So this, you know, is particularly both, you know, in their own home communities of color as well as in their school communities. And then in the LGBT community as well, I would say is a particular unique challenge for young queer girls of color, and particularly gender non-conforming students. Potential family rejection, increased emotional and physical violence, you know, being unfairly targeted, as Dee said, increased risk of mental health, and then basically increased risk of push-out. The last group I would touch on.
Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just hoping that for any of the co-presenters, if you could please turn down the volume on your computer, that would be greatly appreciated because I think we're all hearing some background noise. Thanks, Jeffrey. Please proceed.
Yeah, no problem. It's kind of my soundtrack. So I think that the last group that I would touch on is trans girls of color, which ultimately, if we're talking about the school to prison pipeline and young girls and gender, are the group that is actually directly just ending up in prison, homeless on the streets, in prison, homeless on the streets. So it's just one of the groups that, you know, we at GSA Network have a hard time reaching because by the time high school comes, they're not in school. They're already in continuation or alternative schools. They've already dropped out, been pushed out. And so there's only 2 groups really in the country right now. Here in New York, and this group is in New Orleans, Breakout, and these are 2 of the young trans girls that are members in that organization. And yours truly, and then their organizer. And these 2 organizations are really models for how community wraparound services can be built and address a really urgent and critical need, particularly for the LGBT community, but also for communities of color in which these brilliant young women are being lost to the street. There's 2 there's very few publications out. There's two out that right now. One that I worked on with the Alliance for Educational Justice and the Advancement Project around the intersections of the anti-bullying work that's been going on and the school-to-prison pipeline work, and how we have a critical opportunity to have those two things work in tandem and not counter to each other. And then, like I said, the piece by Aisha Moody Mills and her research team, The Unfair Criminalization of Gay and Transgender Youth, really summarizes basically all of the information that's out there on the issue, from schools to the disproportionate rates of incarceration and criminalization. And that's it from me. I think that the last thing that I would say is that there are groups on the ground doing work in different and various ways, and one of the exciting things that I've found doing this work of kind of coalition and alliance building is that many of them have young women, young queer women leading and at the forefront of their work. And so even though it hasn't been necessarily explicit in the work that they do, that this kind of intersectional piece is alive and forefront in the work that they're doing on the ground. And thank you.
Great. Thanks, Geoffrey. I'm just going to put us on pause for just a minute. This is Laura from GFE, and I'm going to mute all the lines. So for the speaker, to unmute your phone, please press *7, and to mute again, please press *6. Thank you, everyone, and hold on for just a few minutes.
Hi, this is Kevin Jennings. I am the moderator, and apparently, I don't know if everyone heard the introductions earlier. It seems from the online chat they did not. I think we're going to turn to, assuming I'm being heard, we're going to turn to questions and answers now. And I'd like to ask Geoffrey and Monique, someone has asked, would love to hear how some funders have been engaging in this work to support women or LGBTQ, particularly along the education pipeline. I'm wondering if either of you have had partnerships with funders who you think, quote unquote, get it and have been particularly helpful in you to doing your work.
Well, this is Monique. I'll start. The work that I've been done, I think I was funded for this fellowship that is very intentionally and explicitly designed to develop an educational or research and policy framework by which to address the educational factors associated with the overrepresentation of Black girls in confinement. So I think with the Open Society Foundation's investment in this fellowship, that's a clear indication that there's an understanding that we need to do a little bit more to understand what's happening. And also with the Schott Foundation, which has been supporting this work through AAPF and sort of really looking at ways to map it. I think, the research is being funded to an extent, certainly not to the degree that we need it, and certainly not to the degree that we need more participatory action research like the type that Geoffrey was talking about, where there's a critical inclusion of the voices of the affected population. We have been able to do some of that, but it requires a much more long-term investment to really develop and build around that work if you're going to do it authentically. So that kind of support, I think, is needed. Funders are also supporting direct service agencies. Though, again, the programs, we can name them for you, the groups that are engaged in work explicitly around girls in the system and who are really looking at these issues critically. They are often in, sort of critical response mode, and so, there's certainly more partnerships that could be used there. And I would just say that really, we need philanthropic partners to help build the policy and advocacy agenda and the work in that space. The communications work that's been done to date hasn't been very broad in my experience, but rather specific to issues such as incarceration or, really looking at that end of the spectrum and not really supporting the types of partnerships that could take place and should take place between researchers, advocates, and direct service providers, and public agencies, right? So we can also think about ways to support the development of response plans that hold probation, accountable as a partner, that hold schools accountable as a partner, and that, wherein we're really sort of thinking comprehensively about strategies to interrupt.
Geoffrey, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add a few points. So, my initial scope of work was funded through Open Society and was really, from the bird's eye perspective of the funder, that this may be something that could be really powerful, right? That was they were seeing grant reports coming in from one group and from another. But so part of it, I think, is really around what Monique is getting at, is breaking down these silos and really having the ability to make that happen, right, through a grant that's like mine, which is just like, try this out and see if it works. And then, Just and Fair Schools Fund, I think, really brings interesting analysis to the education work in particular around who their grantees are and the type of work that they're doing in schools. And they're also supporting our work in terms of building out this advocacy piece around policy advocacy with the most affected, at the forefront. And I would say that at this point, what we're seeing is that really the most affected and the least talked about are young women and girls of color. And so I guess that, the short answer is yes, there is, and there's so much more work to be done. And I think that kind of this new phase of intersectional work and looking at work that's happening at the intersections is really key to moving that forward.
Great. I'm looking for other questions online. I don't seem to be seeing any. There was a second question, but you sort of just addressed it. Is there financial support for communicate to the public about these issues, especially mobilizing communities to help support and understand what is occurring? I'm wondering, I'll pose my own question to you, Geoffrey and Monique. Have you had difficulty convincing funders to invest in this? And if so, what seems to be driving their reluctance?
Well, I can definitely jump in there. Historically, yes, I've had a very difficult time convincing funders to participate, and I've frankly have had many conversations with funders about what is prohibiting the investment, and often what is happening is just, I would say, not enough information about how these girls are uniquely impacted, and still sort of reflecting the dominant sort of public's understanding about how to make comparisons and how to understand whether this is a crisis or not. There's been a lot of movement and engagement around elevating the male endangerment theme, such that people are saying, we get it. These guys are in trouble. We're going to invest in them because they need us. And when, we enter the conversation with an intersectional lens saying, we want to talk race, but we also want to talk gender. We also want to talk about girls in the gender frame. It becomes very difficult because of the way that we have sort of developed this proposition, this sort of zero-sum space where to talk racial justice is to talk male, and to talk gender is to talk broadly instead of really being able to intersect with a strong racial lens. And so that has, I think, prevented us from being able to move forward, which is partly why I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation, because I think this is the beginning of trying to change some of that, at least trying to understand ways that we might develop new partnerships that do allow and encourage there to be a rigorous interrogation of race and gender and sexual identity and right, and poverty. And so we can really begin to explore what is happening and build relevant and appropriate responses to these issues.
I would just quickly add that, easy answer is yes in the difficulty question, but I think most broadly it's difficulty around getting, funding and investment in young people and youth issues, which is and solutions to youth issues that aren't just funding and building schools or, constructing programs from without that you bring in, but actually investing in youth development and youth leadership as solutions. And so, I would say that as the funding looks to funding youth issues, the lives of young people today are intersectional lives. There's no deconnecting them or delinking them from the communities that they grow up in, and the communities that they grow up in are so much more broad and diverse than I think we even can imagine on this line. So that's what I would say about that.
If you were to say the most critical funding need you think this work has at the moment is ... how would you complete that sentence? Were you able to hear me?
Yes, that was a hard question.
I thought you're both too smart not to have an answer, so I thought maybe I was still on mute.
I mean, I guess what it feels like right now is that the need is so critical that on the ground and, from the advocates to the grassroots, it's employing a strategy of multiplicity and simultaneity, right? Because there's the school to prison pipeline and the education issues have so much more traction than we thought that they would have when we started out the work. At this point that, it's like there's not enough money for the research, but we know what's going on the ground, and there's not enough money to invest in the solutions that we know we can try in small places, but we're not able to elevate, and there's not enough, money to get traction at the national and state levels to make local solutions actually possible, and a broad scale. So I would say there's much need and many places. So depending on what the funding stream and perspective portfolio looks like, there's ways in which to engage at all of those levels, I think, and that the need is there. I have my own particular bias as a youth organizer, and I'm sure Monique has a particular bias as a researcher, and I would say I need the research as much as I need more youth organizations to be able to do this work.
I agree, and I would also say that we can look for opportunities to look where, to invest in the places where we can look cross-portfolio. So I just kind of want to echo what Geoffrey's saying there. When we're looking at conditions of girls and looking specifically at some of the ways in which girls of color are uniquely impacted, there are health intersections, there are organizing intersections, there are, I'm encouraging us not to have the sort of siloed space around, this is education funding and therefore must only operate in, a certain way. Many schools are thinking outside the box, particularly if they're working with high-risk girls of color, to advance wraparound services in schools, to really look at promising and effective models therein. And, yes, I believe the research is important, but I also was emphasizing action-oriented participatory research because I don't believe in conducting research just for the sake of advancing our knowledge, but rather to change structures and approaches. And I believe, that demonstrating that through the experiences and participation of the affected community is critical to that piece. I also want to say, though, that when I was saying that it's difficult to do and it requires our investment, because we should do it with integrity and we should provide funding for those individuals to be co-inquirers and to be co-developers of policy responses, but there really just hasn't been enough investment. I've gone in and spoken with girls, whole groups of girls in different cities, and I hear the same thing over and over again, which is, we would love it if you could come back or if somebody could do this with us every week, but nobody comes, nobody can do this, and largely because there's no grand investment or structure designed to really respond to them the way that they are both calling for and need.
Great, Geoffrey, we have a question specifically for you. The writer asks, Geoffrey, you've described the role of youth leadership in this work and in building important alliances and forming solutions together. What are your observations on the potential opportunities and challenges for adults and parent leaders who want to engage meaningfully in this work?
Yes, thank you. There's a reason I'm a youth organizer. So, I would say that for an example, the youth have a National Student Bill of Rights in which LGBT rights are fully immersed in the Student Bill of Rights. And their main concern is that not enough LGBT youth have weighed in on it to have it be, to have it have legitimacy, which is like a lot of LGBT youth have already weighed in on it. So, I think, and that's their starting point. So I think that the challenges are multiple and great. And I think that, we're in a particularly interesting moment where the challenges that the adults are facing are really challenges of America, right? Of the United States culture that has been, and what we're looking at with the youth is the America that's going to be. And I think that it's really, it's sad and it's also inspiring, right? Because in the Alliance for Educational Justice collaboration that we work with, for example, they do have parents groups that take their leadership from the young people. And so the fact that the whole conference that we were just at did preferred gender pronouns, and there was a card that you wrote and you put on your name with your name tag that said your PGP, and that everyone did it, including, the church ladies and the youth, was an amazing experience. And so I think that part of the challenge is that part of it is letting go of the ideas that, the adult solutions are going to work for the new century. But I know that feels really squishy, but I really can't, part of, I think, the challenge is, for me, is trying to figure this out, is trying to figure out how do we bring the full potential advocacy weight of the adult communities that are invested at some level in the success of young people, I have to believe, to the actual place where they can believe that young people's solutions are solutions that will work.
I think Geoffrey, I just want to say, has actually hit on something very important, and so I want to echo it, and it's that one of the most powerful things adults can do to support youth is to provide a space for them and their voices.
Another question, person says for both, but especially for Geoffrey. What advocacy or policy strategies have you found effective beyond implementing an anti-bullying policy, i.e., how do we implement culture change where girls of color, queer folks, etc., all have a safe learning environment?
Yeah, great question. And I think that that's the exciting work of kind of the school discipline reform movement right now, and I think that's one of the places where we lack the data and actually just the time of having alternatives in place to know. Young people and people all over the country are coming up with alternative discipline models. So from restorative justice circles to youth courts to, just flatly rejecting all suspensions and expulsions as a method of discipline, from what we're seeing, in Colorado and Denver with Padres y Jóvenes Unidos and the whole Denver school district adopting stuff, to Oakland where they have restorative justice programming. And it's really about whether or not we can capture if these are solutions that work for young people. And my thought and feeling and sense anecdotally is that yes, because they're processes that are guided and driven by young people. And so, I think only time will tell, and investment in the actual particular elevation of the solutions and successes, I think is key. What I would say, from Dr. Dorothy Espelage, who I would say is one of the leading folks in doing the anti-bullying research, is that there's not any quote-unquote anti-bullying programs in the United States that work. And so we can't look to kind of canned one-size-fits-all adopt a model anti-bullying policy that is going to address kind of the, particularly for young queer girls, the levels of stigmatization and harassment that they get. And, a lot of the harassment is couched in sexual harassment most broadly, but is very kind of vicious in its undertones of homophobia. So, I think that the solutions that we want are being formulated right now and percolating up from the ground, and it's our duty, from this vantage point, to figure out how do we elevate those solutions to a place where, that those successes are being heard and seen and adopted.
It's also important before we begin to replicate that we clearly understand, again, whether those are the strategies that work, right? I've been in part of conversations with the folks who are facilitating many of the restorative circles in schools, and we've had very explicit conversations about the extent to which those are compatible with the cultural norms among Black girls. and to see whether they're working or not, and whether there might just need to be some adaptations to those to accurately capture how bullying plays out among these girls, which is slightly different than the way that it might play out among other groups, and, you know, to make sure we get that information before we just roll out and replicate.
Yeah, and I would say that, you know, what is exciting is that there's different solutions coming out from different communities, and that everything is so new right now, right? And that and that we don't know, and that there's potential for that there to be actually something in there that is replicable, but it may be something that you know, it may be something where it's a very local in terms of what the community's solutions are in a restorative and positive way to the
Great. I don't have any other online questions, so if there's somebody listening who'd simply like to press *7, unmute themselves and ask a question, I'll invite them to do so. Okay. I was asked to kind of wrap things up a little bit by offering the perspective of a funder. And I bring two different lenses to that. First of all, as someone who ran a large grant-making office in the federal government, and now as someone who runs a private foundation. What are the obstacles and barriers? One of the things that's very clear from this presentation, and I thank both Geoffrey and Monique for doing an excellent job, is that there is a real problem, but there is not the resources available from funders to address the problem. Why is that? I think it's a complex mix of issues. I would say, first of all, we have to recognize, plain and simple, that sexism is very real and alive in America today. We simply privilege the lives of men and boys over the lives of women and girls, as we have done for centuries in this society. To put it more humorously, there's the great line of Nora Ephron, who once said about the movie-making industry, Hollywood would rather make a movie about a man with a hangnail than a woman with cancer. And that continues to be true in the funding world as well. The second issue we have, and I think this has been pointed out by both Monique and Geoffrey, is that when we do have an interest in girls' and women's lives, it is usually in what we call cisgender girls and women. And for people who are not familiar with that term, cisgender means someone who conforms to people's socially accepted ideas around gender identity and gender expression, as opposed to someone who is transgender, who is someone who transgresses what society has deemed are the appropriate boundaries around gender expression. Monique specifically talked about the gender presentation of many of these young girls and how that offends certain authorities, and funders fall into that trap as well. These are not the cisgender children that we have been taught to privilege. The third issue is, because of the fact that we have not valued or privileged the lives of women and girls in general, and in particular gender nonconforming women and girls, we simply don't have as good of data as we do on some other topics. While there has been a lot of wonderful research, and Geoffrey shared a lot of it, the fact is we have a bit of a data deficit. The government has not gathered data in any systematic way on transgender people at all, and it's gathered very, very little data on lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, and frankly has gathered a lot more data about men than women. So that allows people to perpetuate the idea that this is not really a problem because the data isn't out there. And if it was really a problem, we'd have tons of data. Well, you tend to find the data you're looking for, and we do not look for this data with the same intensity as we do other forms of data. Then I'd make two last points. At the risk of engaging a little bit of gender stereotyping myself, boys often tend to act out their issues in more public and more visible and sometimes violent ways than girls do. For example, on the issue of bullying, boys have been statistically shown to be more likely to push or shove someone than girls, who are more likely to engage in what we call relational aggression, which is something such as the spreading of rumors or engaging in cyberbullying. So boys issues are sometimes more visible to the authorities than girls. Now, that's obviously mediated by a lot of other factors and is not true in every school, in every place, or in every population, but it allows for people to imagine that the girls and transgender young people are not suffering quite as much because their suffering may not be quite as visible to some of the authorities. And the final thing that we are dealing with here is foundations. This is a general-wide problem in both foundations and in the government. In government, basically, the longest any grant can go is 3 to 4 years, and those are rare. Many foundations engage in similar grant-making practices. These are not problems that are solved easily in 1, 2, 3, or 4 years. They are problems that have taken decades, if not centuries, to develop. They take a great deal of time and energy to address, and what foundations and government funders have tended to do is, first of all, either not give enough resources to make an impact on the problem, or to pull out resources before enough time has been given for us to see significant improvement. So I think a combination of these factors, of sexism, of the privileging of traditional forms of gender identity and gender expression, of the lack of data and the comparative invisibility of the suffering of non-gender conforming young people as well as of women and girls, and the difficulty and long time frame that is necessary to see improvements in this arena have led many funders to simply wash their hands and say, I'm not interested. If we take anything away from today's call, it is that we need to recognize that this is a real problem that we need to invest in with the resources that are necessary to make a sustainable and substantial difference. I used to play hockey when I was a kid, and our coach used to say to us, if you keep doing what you're doing, you'll keep getting what you're getting. Unless we change our grant-making strategies, unless we begin to put resources into addressing this issue, we will continue to see the problems that both Geoffrey and Monique have so beautifully and eloquently described today persist in our society to the tremendous disadvantage and harm of young people. So I'm hopeful that today was helpful to many of you in identifying these issues and will help provoke thoughts from you about how you might change your grant-making strategies or deepen your grant-making strategies in order to help wonderful groups such as Gay Straight Alliance Network to address them more effectively.
Great.
So Geoffrey and Monique, why don't I let you guys have any last comments, and then we'll move towards conclusion.
Well, this is Monique. And I would just say that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present and share a bit more, and this conversation is just the beginning. I'm sure many of you will have a chance to observe what we produce over the next couple of months, and I look forward to continuing in this dialogue.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you all for your interest in this issue. It's, I think, very urgent and prescient, the timing of it, and I look forward to speaking to you all about the work in the future. Thank you.
Great, and I just wanted to say a special thanks again to both Geoffrey and Monique for presenting, as well as Kevin for moderating. This is Delora from Grantmakers for Education, and before we sign off, I'd like to take a brief minute to mention some of GFE's future programs. First, our annual conference titled Philanthropy Rising to the Challenge, Leading a Nation More at Risk, will be in Houston, Texas this October from the 16th through 18th, and we hope all of you will be able to join us. Secondly, GFE will offer 2 member briefings, the first of which is focused on early learning and improving outcomes for kids of color and ELLs in the first 8 years. That is occurring in Minneapolis, Minnesota, May 6th through 8th. The second is focused on collective impact, strengthening the practice of cross-sector collaboration, from May 22nd through the 24th at Aspen, Colorado. And although registration has closed for both programs, please keep your eyes peeled for key takeaways and grant-making strategies to inform your work. And now for a few closing thoughts. First, as a reminder, the full webinar presentation will be available on GFE's website, and we will also email the information to you. We will also follow up later today to provide you with an evaluation of today's program. The survey is short, so please take 5 minutes to fill it out. Your comments, as always, help us improve our program. Thanks again, everyone, for participating on today's webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Please stand by.